Yo, what's shaking, everybody? It's another edition of the Orange Bloods Texas Football Channel. I'm Geoff. That's Anwar. Do us a solid. Slap that like button. Punch that button that allows you to be a subscriber to the channel. We're talking NFL draft prospects today. Mel Kiper Jr. comes out with his top 25 list going into next season, his first top 25 list. And yes, Bijan Robinson in the top 10. Yes, a couple of more Longhorns, not in the top 25, but in the top 10 position groups that we'll be talking about. And Anwar, a whole lot of Alabama guys that will be coming to town in week 2, including the number 1 player on Mel Kiper's list and the number 2 player on Mel Kiper's list. And if we just want to go ahead and throw it out there, the number 8 player on Mel Kiper's list. Let's start with Bijan Robinson.
Start with the
number 10 on a top overall board of prospects. He's the number 1 ranked running back on Mel Kiper Jr.'s early lists and the number 10 overall player. Personally, I was a little bit surprised, mainly because running back value is somewhat limited now when we talk about the NFL draft. And as much as you and I love and respect Bijan Robinson as a player and think he's phenomenal, he hasn't had that monster season yet that, I don't even, in a weird way, I don't even know if he's had the Xavier Worthy season yet, where you look back and your jaw kind of drops at what he's doing. Your initial reaction to where he's slotted and kind of, what our expectations should be of him now moving forward, now that he's not, we already knew he was on the map, but this kind of stuff cements him as one of the most important players in college football.
Yeah, because it's so interesting, Ketch, because we know that the NFL doesn't always value running backs. It's not to say they're not important, but we've seen the trend, Ketch, of them saying, all right, let's get the guys in the second round, even guys who are tremendously talented, very late first round kind of picks. And to have a top 10 says a lot for a guy. Like you said, we're not talking about a guy who's coming off of 1,500 yards or 2,000 combined yards. Like, we're talking about a guy who had a good season, got hurt towards the end. But it's clear from an evaluation standpoint, he clearly checks all the boxes for what you want as far as an NFL running back is concerned. Again, not to say he's not a good running back, but he's clearly checking all the boxes of Bill. First of all, Ketch, he showed up with an NFL body, right? I mean, when he stepped on campus, we were all like, dang.
Remember that one-handed catch that he made that was on somebody's Twitter video, and it was like, ooh.
And I guarantee you, Ketch, there's probably been some NFL GM who looked at that same video and like, ooh, that's impressive. None of our guys can do that. You can't do it in a game, but the athleticism, the coachability, the system. I mean, top 10 is very. If you told me first round, I would have said, okay, not a problem. Top 10 is in the country. That says a lot. That shows me that guy should be driving a Lambo right now, Ketch. If you're telling me anything, if anybody should be driving a Lambo, it's clearly Bijan.
Yeah, and it's funny. I hadn't given it any. I don't know what my expectations were, right? So I'm about to ask you a question related to his slotting at number 10. If you had told me yesterday before I saw the list, Kiper's going to release a top 25, Bijan's on it, where do I think Bijan in a top 25 would be ranked? I don't know that I have a good answer. So the question I want to throw back towards you is this. If 10 is the starting point on a Kiper list, in your mind today, does Bijan go above that? Does he go below that in the actual draft? And if he's the number 1 overall running back and he's 10 now, I'm throwing a bunch of questions at you.
Yeah.
What is it as obvious? I was going to say, what will it take for him to get higher than that? Probably a monster season. So let's just start with that. I think I answered my question there. If I had you make $1,000 bet on above or below 10, what's your gut tell you today?
I'm going to go below only just because, first of all, these mock drafts are going to change. This is his first one. it's now. I mean, by the time we get around to the season, he's going to be on mock draft like 18.5, right? And usually for me, Catch, when I look at stuff, and now it's tough because the top 10 doesn't always change around a lot. But I'm just, then it's need. Does a team in front of you need a running back? So I'm always cautious with these things. You know me, Catch. When I start hearing about guys being, possible third day picks, you know me, I always add 2 to 3 rounds to that. So if you tell me a guy, and I do it every year. You tell me a guy is like a 4th round or 5th round, I'm like, okay, so that's easily undraftable. Like, you've always got to do a +2 with those guys. And it happened. We saw with Josh Thompson that people could predicted that he would be maybe a 5th round pick. And I was like, potentially undrafted. So when I'm seeing something, I always just on a cautious point say, okay, I'm going to take it down just a couple of levels. But if he goes out and has 1,400 yards and he looks like the running back that Sarkisian had at Alabama, first of all, Texas is having a damn good season. More than likely that success is going to go well and breed well for them. So, we look at the weapons that they have this year. Who do you focus on? Like that's the thing. That's the thing that teams will have to really decide. Catch, like, are they going to focus on stopping the run, or they're going to focus on stopping the pass? And if they decide the games that they're going to focus on stopping the pass, then yeah, it would be very easy for the Bijan to have a monster season.
I think one of the things that at such a high spot, I think even a disappointment. Let's say he has injuries, right? Let's say he plays in 6 games this season for whatever reason. His early positioning, I think, in the eyes of NFL people would lead me to believe that if he came out anyway, he's still probably a 2nd round pick. It's hard for me to imagine a guy that going into the year is a top 10 level pick and the number 1 player at his position. So more than anything, it just feels like come rain or shine, Bijan's established himself as an NFL prospect. We're going to talk about a couple of other Longhorns that are on the list, and they're in a little bit more of a precarious position. First of all, color me very surprised that Jaleel Billingsley comes in as the number 3 H-back/fullback. Now, there's an entirely different category for tight ends. So Kiper comes up with this list, and I don't know what it means to make a fullback H-back list, because I guarantee you some of the guys in that top 10 probably don't get drafted. Fullbacks aren't the most popular creatures in the NFL draft, but he's number 3. And DeMarvion Overshown comes in as the number 7 inside linebacker. Were you to project that versus last year's draft, that probably means he would go somewhere between the 4th and the 6th round. That probably feels about right for DeMarvion Overshown up until this point. Your initial reaction on both of those guys? They're the only other 2 players in the program listed in that spot. So none of the defensive linemen, no Deshaun Jameson. I mean, nobody else on the roster cracks the top 10. Overshown doesn't surprise me fully, but Billingsley did.
Yeah, the Overshown thing doesn't surprise. It's one of the things that, the NFL likes guys who are converted safeties, guys who can get sideline to sideline. And so because he has that speed, because he's a converted safety, you can look at him and say, okay, that's the prototypical linebacker in today's NFL, especially with, the offenses starting to look like college offenses. You want to have those kind of speed guys. You don't necessarily need, the big traditional linebackers that you once had at one point. The Billingsley thing is interesting, Catch, because we view Billingsley as a guy who's probably in a position battle at this point. And we're trying to figure out, between him and Jatavian Sanders and Gunnar Helm and, the other guys in that room, where does he fall, within that pecking order? And I think we still got to figure that portion out. So it's very interesting that he comes in with that pedigree as a top 10 prospect at his position, top 10 for the NFL, and not really based off of a big body of work at Alabama that makes that argument very convincing. But again, some intangibles that are there. And clearly he's talking to some people who are telling him they've got an eye on Jaleel and believe in what he can be. It's a little surprising, but maybe there's enough body of work. Maybe there's enough that people have seen at Bama that have them convinced. But we're still waiting to see Ketchum again between him and Jatavian Sanders. I mean, who ends up being the guy that sees the field the most and gets the most touches, most targets, most blocking opportunities? Like that's still to be determined. So props to Jaleel, but we still got to see what happens, in this upcoming season.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%, really and truly. You think back to his Alabama career, and Jaleel Billingsley was a guy that he's got tape, right? I mean, so you can put his highlights together on film, and you go, okay, that guy can do something. But the reality was, he's kind of I was going to say a bit player at Alabama, and maybe that is accurate, right? I don't mean to demean his Alabama career, but there's talk that he had been in Nick Saban's doghouse occasionally, not a Jai Hall level doghouse, but doghouse. Yeah, I'm sure everybody in that Alabama program finds themselves in the Saban doghouse at some point in their career. But he does come to Texas, and I wouldn't say that he blew the doors off of everybody during the spring. I mean, had a good, solid spring, but I think there was just as much buzz or more from Jatavian Sanders and Gunnar Helm. And even when you get into the spring game, those guys were sharing a lot of reps with the ones, whereas Billingsley was getting a lot of work with the twos in that scrimmage. Just my gut instinct where I asked you, like, hey, Bijan, does he get drafted higher than 10th or lower than 10th? I think if I look at that list of H-backs, fullbacks, and ask myself today, do I think he'll be the third H-back / fullback taken in the draft, which probably gets him in the first 2 days? I mean, I got to imagine if you're a top 3 H-back in the NFL draft, you're going before the end of the third round. Those players have a lot of value. Until I see more, I would probably go under and say in 5 months from now, when Kiper's done his 8th revision, that list will look different. And I don't know that Billingsley is there. Overshown is the guy that we're waiting for a breakout. Overshown's a guy that on the opposite side of the fence, and for the record, I would have said that Overshown would have done this a year ago. So we're waiting, but I'm waiting for this breakout from Overshown where the playmaking side of the position shows up. And I think if he does that, he's a guy that has a chance to go, I think, from maybe a 5th or 6th round pick based on where he's currently slotted to maybe a day 2 guy who can slip into the 3rd round because his athleticism and playmaking ability as an athlete are there. It has to translate to the field. And, quite frankly, if DeMarvion doesn't do it, now we're looking around the defense and asking who is. He's just such a critical player to what Texas wants to accomplish this year as a team.
I've got a question for you.
Go for it.
And you asked me a good one. So I think let me see if I can get you one that might stump you. Okay. Is there a Longhorn that isn't currently on this list that you think could be on this list as a top 10 player at their position for the next draft?
No, I got you. It's such a young team. Here's what I'm going to do real quick. Because when Kiper does this, he mainly looks at seniors. He's not projecting juniors this early on the deal. So what we're talking about is, let me run through the list. The seniors on this Texas team right now are Roschon Johnson. Do I think he's a top 10 running back? No, but if Bijan got hurt, let's say Bijan just had a bad injury and Roschon got 8 or 9 starts, I could see Roschon Johnson cracking a top 10 running back list in a world where he's getting all of the carries and is a frontline player as opposed to the backup of the guy who's the number 10 guy. Junior Angelau, Christian Jones, Keandre Coburn, Tavondre Sweat. Maybe I'll give you one. actually.
Okay.
Anthony Cook at safety.
That's a good one.
I think he would have not been drafted, obviously, very high had he come out. But he was one of the few high-performing players on this team a year ago in the nickel. Kind of had his position marginalized because of they played his personnel package groupings less down the stretch than they did earlier in the season. He makes the full-time move to safety. He's a guy that comes in with an elite recruiting pedigree, and NFL scouts can say they don't love guys that were highly rated recruits, but they don't hate them. They're guys that get drafted all the time in the late rounds, and you're like, God, that guy didn't do anything other than was a big-time recruit in high school, and clearly they're just taking a chance on a guy that was expected to do more. Anthony Cook, I was going to say Deshaun Jameson, but I've sold my Deshaun Jameson stock. Anthony Cook is a guy that by the end of this season, I could see being living. He does have the versatility to play in the slot and as a nickel guy in the NFL. And those guys are generally viewed very well. If you can play multiple positions in the secondary as a college player projecting to the NFL, you'll have a job for a very long time.
You're absolutely right. So, I mean, that versatility that's back there, I mean, it definitely, helps. I mean, and look, I mean, Chris Boyd is doing great in the NFL. I mean, and I don't think in college we looked at him and thought Chris Boyd would be that guy in the NFL, but he is. So, could Anthony Cook be a guy that follows in that mold? Like potentially, I think you're 100% correct. So you put Cook as the guy. There's probably no one else that jumps in there from a senior standpoint.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe Ovio Gofu? I mean, that's a long shot.
Yeah.
But they're expecting him to have to take on a big role. If we lived in a world where Ovi had a big breakout season, let's say 7 or 8 sacks, that might not get him into the top 10 of his position, but it might not be that far away either. So, we're talking about guys that really have to perform at levels that they haven't performed at yet. But, I'm fishing a little bit here. One thing you don't have to fish for, Anwar, are Alabama players on this list. No surprise.
They're everywhere.
Alabama defensive end Will Anderson, the number 1 ranked player on the list. That's not a shock. You could have made a case that he deserved the Heisman a year ago as a defensive player. He was that good. Speaking of Heisman trophies, Bryce Young is number 2 on the list, 1 spot above Ohio State quarterback C.J. Stroud. I think that's going to be a really interesting quarterback debate over the course of the next 9 months or so, 10 months. And then Alabama cornerback Eli Ricks, who arrived through the portal this offseason, listed as the number 8 prospect on this board. It must be nice to go to the portal and just land the number 1 cornerback in the country and in the draft with the snap of a fingers because you're Alabama and because you're Nick Saban and because you've done so much. It just reinforces when Alabama comes to town in week 2, you've got the number 1 ranked player in the draft facing off against the number 1 question mark on the entire roster for this Texas team right now. You've got a quarterback at the number 2 spot going against a Texas defense that wasn't good a year ago. And oh, by the way, that Eli Ricks, Xavier Worthy showdown in week 2 might be the best single one-on-one showdown we see of any 2 players the entire season while covering Texas. Because I think Xavier Worthy is going to be a first-round draft pick when it's all said and done. Ricks is going to be potentially a top 10 pick. Both of those 2 guys have a chance in that game to add just a little bit more street cred to their reputation than they already own.
Yeah, Ketchum, as I'm going through this list as we're talking, There's also guys who rank within their top 10. You know, they've got Jamar Gibbs at running back. He's right below Bijan Robinson. Catch
another transfer.
Yeah, they've got 2 wide receivers on this list. Catch Tyler Harrell, Jermaine Burton. Harrell at 5, Burton at number 9. At the tight end position, they've got Cameron. I don't know how to say his last name. Latu. He's listed there. I'm just looking at every position. Catch.
They've got 2 top 10 guards.
2 top 10 guards. So
they've got 2 top 10 defensive ends. So not just Will Anderson, but Byron Young is the number 7 defensive end, which probably makes him like a second-round pick at this point in the NFL draft because that position has such value. They've got the number 3 inside linebacker, Henry Tuatua. I think is how you say his name. He's the transfer from Tennessee from a year ago. Mm-hmm. And then just to finish it out, they have 3 safeties in the top 10. They've got the number 3 safety, Jordan Battle, the number 5 safety, Brian Branch, and the number 7 safety, and DeMarco Helms. I've lost count. That's a lot of Alabama.
The Catch. So there's a couple of things. We've talked to people on the Alabama side, and what they've told us, Catch, was that this year's team would be better than last year's team. Like, undoubtedly, that's the way they felt about this team going into it. I mean, again, we're just talking seniors, right? So we're not even getting into any underclassmen that are on there, future prospects. We're just talking about tried and true NFL prospects. People, think that we kind of take the Dennis Green approach when we talk about Alabama. We want to crown their ass, then crown them. You gotta have to crown them, man. Like, you've got to understand what's coming to town in week 2. It is real deal big boy football, no doubts about it. And I understand you're a Texas fan, you're going to talk yourself into some believing, but we just know that from a talent standpoint, Catch, you would have to look. This might be one of the most talented teams that's faced a Texas team in a very long time. I mean, you may have to go back to that USC team.
No, that LSU team.
The LSU team was pretty good, yes.
But the thing about that was interesting about that is that nobody was quite talking about LSU. You know what I mean? Like, we look back at it now and go, oh, man, Joe Burrow, for instance. Correct. But going into that game, he had way less of a reputation than Sam Ehlinger did. So this is about guys with big reputations, going into the season. And I counted it up. It's 13 players that are listed in the top 10 of their positions, most of them in the top 5. That Alabama team's going to be everything that we talked about it. And the good news is, if you're Texas and you put in I don't even know let's say they lose 34-24.
Okay.
Right? They lose by 10. It's not a blowout, but they kind of stand toe-to-toe for 3 quarters. That would be phenomenal for Texas, because Alabama's what they're trying. That's what they aspire to be. And, they're not ready for that yet. But whatever it is that they do against Alabama, especially if it's good, we'll be able to project that and say that was against a team with a lot of talent. And, Texas is able to protect. It's like the games inside the games. If they're able to protect Quinn Ewers in the pocket, you're going to look, and let's say they give up 2 sacks. You're going to look back at that and you're going to say, that's really damn good. Like, the rest of the season, we should be okay along the offensive line if you get through the Alabama game and it's not a jailbreak with Will Anderson. I was looking at his stats on this. That dude had 79 quarterback pressures last year to go with 17 and a half sacks.
Wow.
79 quarterback pressures.
Wow.
And that means he's getting to the quarterback about 6 times a game. And that's not sacking him. He gets those too, but he's getting to the quarterback once every 5 or 6 plays, probably during the course of a game. He's just, there's a lot that we're going to learn. A couple of other names on that list, so I don't want to spend too much time just, thirsting after Alabama's players, because quite frankly, we could just do a video where all we do is drool over what Alabama will bring to the table from a talent standpoint. Only 2 Big 12 names on Kiper's top 25. Number 16 is Baylor defensive tackle Siaki Ika, who basically was their foundation in the middle last year on defense. Doesn't put up a bunch of big plays, right? He's not Will Anderson from a playmaking standpoint. He's a monster in the middle, though, that was in a lot of ways the key to Baylor's success. Interesting that he makes that list along with Bijan Robinson. No Oklahoma players, and it feels like that's notable because it does not feel like we've gone into most seasons going back since you've been here, right?
Yeah.
You've almost been at Orange Bloods for a decade now. It feels like every year Oklahoma has quarterbacks, receivers, offensive linemen, players on that list, and if they don't this year, this weirdly speaks to the state of the Big 12, I think, in the perception that it's kind of wide open. It's just not a league that has a lot of elite players in it, projection-wise, going into the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I think this has to be the thing, Ketch, when you start talking about offseason, and if you're a Texas fan and trying to give yourself hope, okay, Alabama is going to be, a tough out. You understand that going in. But then they play that tricky game, we've done it before, but when you start looking at other programs, if you're Texas, you've got to say, you know what? From a talent standpoint, we match up well with just about everyone. And from a talent standpoint, probably technically have more talent at a lot of the positions than most of the other programs. Now, again, that's a tricky game. It's a tricky game because we've done this before when you're like, okay, well, when Baker Mayfield is gone, then who's going to, Kyler Murray, what's going to happen there? And it's like, oh, my bad. And then Kyler Murray's gone, and you go, okay, well, what happens after that? And then Jalen Hurts happens, right? And then you get past that, and then, you had, and then you had Spencer Rattler. Like, oh, this young guy, what's going to happen with Spencer Rattler? And then Spencer Rattler's okay. And then Spencer Rattler gets benched. You're like, all right, finally. And then that happens. So
Texas wins that game last year, Anwar. If Spencer Rattler had just been a little bit better than terrible, if he's just good, Texas wins that game by double digits. But he was terrible, and in comes Caleb Williams, and Katie barred the door.
I mean, it's almost like a fear factor when Oklahoma benches their quarterback. Like, oh Lord, not again. Don't need that guy doing it. So, but you look at teams, and look, Texas can't look at anybody and say we've got that team, not based off of what they did last year, right? That's just not real, because other teams are looking at Texas with the same perspective. But if you for a breath of fresh air, like I said, this team has got talent on there. If the coaching matches the talent that they have, it should be a better season, because there's nobody in here, Ketch, that you just stand on the table and say that team is loaded. They've got a bunch of killers. Not how we look at Bama. We don't look at any team like we look at Bama. And so because you don't have that, that's where you got to say, all right, so you're saying there's a chance? I mean, technically, yes.
Not a single Big 12 quarterback makes Kiper's early top 10 list. And that would include Dylan Gabriel, the kid that transfers from Central Florida to Oklahoma, their projected starter. This time last year, Spencer Rattler wouldn't have been draft eligible, but people were talking about him being the future number 1 pick in the draft. You had Brock Purdy. You had guys that would have been in that top 10. The fact that it's a conference without a dominant quarterback coming into the year, I think is that's a really good thing for Texas because you know what you have. You've got a dynamic young guy who's starting from zero. These other guys all have quarterbacks who, for the most part, aren't starting at zero, but they're not starting at like 80 or 90 either. They're not legitimate big-time NFL guys. At this point, it doesn't look – I would say that Kiper – I don't know that he projects anybody in the Big 12 at the quarterback position to be drafted this year. That bodes well for Texas. A few other names of interest – just to read them off, and then we can react to them. Our guy Deuce Vaughn. Remember we had the Bijan Deuce Vaughn conversation just like a week or two ago. Deuce Vaughn, the number 6 running back on Kiper's list. It makes me feel less guilty that we did the Bijan Deuce because that probably is the best draft debate amongst players in the Big 12. You could have one at wide receiver. There's a couple of Big 12 wide receivers that make the list. Quentin Johnston, who was a former Texas target at wide receiver. He's the number 6 guy. Marvin Mims at Oklahoma is number 10. Then you get beyond that. Connor Galvin is the number 10 offensive tackle, and Anton Harrison is the number 7 offensive tackle. But again, not players really at the top of their positions. There's nobody that Cooper Beebe is the number 8 offensive guard. Kansas State as a team, we need to do a video on in the next month or so. Kansas State people believe they're going to compete for a Big 12 championship this year. They're probably the sleeper in the league. And, their talent on paper at least looks as good as a lot of other teams that we've been talking about. No centers. Tyree Wilson makes it as a defensive end, along with Tyler Lacey from Oklahoma State. Both of them 6 and number 8, respectively. We talked about Ika as a defensive tackle, but nobody else mentioned. Nobody else mentioned in inside linebackers. Nobody mentioned outside linebackers. TCU's got a cornerback, Travius Hodges Tomlinson. And then after that, and that's pretty much it. It's a Big 12, and maybe this shouldn't be a shocker because the Big 12 just finished the year in terms of drafted players way down the list in the power conferences. What it looks like on paper going into this season is more of the same.
Yeah, Catch. I mean, it's not getting better, and it's definitely not going to be better when Oklahoma and Texas leave. Like, it's not like you're going to come in and all of a sudden, like, whoa, that UCF Oklahoma State matchup is going to be something to watch. Where you got to see 2 standouts going against each other. I'm not saying they won't have some talent, but it is. We clearly know the difference between the haves and the have-nots. Very interesting because basically, Catch, I think based off of what you're saying, did we just go into the season saying Bijan is the best player in the Big 12?
Easily.
Right? I mean, there's no debate, right? I
mean, the only other – you could make a case that Ika, the defensive tackle from Baylor, both based on his initial ranking and the fact that he was a legitimate impact player a year ago. He's a 350-pound defensive tackle that had 4 sacks. In addition to just clogging up lanes, taking on blockers, that guy actually has proven to be a playmaker for a huge guy. But Oklahoma only has 2 names on the list. The number 7 offensive tackle and the number 10 wide receiver. Baylor's got a couple of guys on the list. I think I counted 1 guy for Oklahoma State. From a talent perspective, you would say that there's a chance when this season ends that Texas could be regarded as the most talented roster and team in the league. They've got to go do it on the field, but remember this time last year, we'd have been talking about Iowa State and all those seniors that they had. And look, they had a great running back. They had an experienced quarterback. They had the best tight end in the league. They had a lot of guys that got drafted. Yeah. That doesn't exist this year. And I think that, the door's open for Texas. And it was open a year ago, but it feels like it's even wider right now. And it's just a matter of whether or not this Texas program under Steve Sarkisian is ready to drive through the door. There are not a lot of there's no mega talented team standing in its way It's just some good football teams with great coaching, and Texas has got to find a way to navigate that in a way that it didn't a year ago. Hey, before we do any parting shots, do us a favor. Leave your comments in the comments section. Thoughts on, is there anybody that Kiper forgot from the Big 12 that's worthy of and it can't be Xavier Worthy. He's not draft eligible. But anybody draft eligible that we didn't talk about that should have been talked about, feel free to leave your comments in the comments section. Again, we'll plead with you, like the video for us, subscribe to the channel, get those notifications. Onward, any final thought?
You know, just an overall thing, and maybe this is a video for another day. As I was just writing down, I'm thinking about the overall NFL talent that's on this team with Quinn Ewers, not just 2023, but with Quinn, Bijan, Roshan at 3, Jaleel Billingsley at 4, Isaiah Nayer at 5, Whittington and Xavier Worthy, DeMarvion Overshown, Anthony Cook. Like, that's just off the top of our heads at this moment. This might be a team that we look back on and say, man, there was a lot of talented players on this team that we just didn't realize at that moment. But I also do believe that, again, subject for another day, I think when Texas fans start seeing all that talent that's out here, the expectation levels of what they want the season to look like will definitely increase.
I think that's a great point. I think if you're a Texas fan watching this video, the expectations may have climbed, right? You may be listening to that and going, there's nothing that Ketchum Anwar talked about that should scare us outside of Alabama in week 2. Mm-hmm. Everything else, there's no reason why it shouldn't be doable. So do it. Leave your comment in the comment section. Tell us where you think we were right, where we think we were wrong. Where do you think Bijan goes in this draft? Are there any Longhorns that you think, beyond the guys that we mentioned, do you think Anthony Cook could go even higher than we were talking about? That's what the comment section is for. Anwar is on his way to vacation. This will be the last video that you see him in for. When are you coming back?
I'm not telling you. I think get back on.
That's what he might know.
Tuesday.
Not next week, right?
Next week. Okay. Yeah, just sometime on Tuesday. So I'll be back next Wednesday.
All right. Well, look, for myself and Anwar Richardson, I'm not going anywhere. In fact, the plan is today I'll be doing a live show tonight. So stick around. We'll get the modcast tomorrow, all kinds of content here on the Orange Bloods Texas Football channel. No reason not to subscribe and become a full-time member of what we're doing here on the YouTube channel. Until next time, you guys be safe. Take care of each other. Wish Anwar nothing but great times on this vacation. We'll talk to you soon. Later.